Good morning. Today is the 9th day of Tevet. And tomorrow is the fast of the 10th of Tevet. The day on which the Assyrian army touched the walls of Jerusalem and they began their siege. And today, actually 8th, 9th, and 10th were all fast days once. People used to fast 3 days. The 8th was the day on which the Torah was translated into Greek. And that happened about 100 years before the story of Hanukkah. And the sages have an interpretation that weakened, the translation of the Torah into Greek weakened the ability of the Jews to remain independent from Hellenic culture. And it sort of brought them aboard with the rest of the world. And that led to Hanukkah. And then the 9th is considered to be the day on which Ezra passed away. Ezra the scribe, as we say. And Ezra is considered a reincarnation of Moses because it was almost like a second giving of the Torah when he started what we call, and this was different, and it's like the opposite side of translating it into Greek. He started what is known as interpreting the Torah, explaining it, but explaining it within Judaism. And then the 10th is the day on which the Assyrians touched the walls of the Babylonians. I said Assyrians. I said it twice. The Babylonians touched the wall of Jerusalem. All three of these days have to do with the weakening of the barrier between the Torah and the rest of the world, and making the Torah and the Jewish people just another part, another group, another ethnic group in the world, and seeing it as not having a divine mission to rectify the world. Okay, so we have to do something to fix that today. So today is like we said, it's the 9th day of Tevet, and it's the 2nd day of January. So we're in chapter 3, I believe. לשם הבנת יתרון הרגל לגבי הראש, וכן הבנת הקשר שבין סגולת הרגל לבין שבט אשר, יש להסביר תחילה את עניינו של מחנה דן, ששבט אשר שימש חלק ממנו. So we already did a lot of this. We mentioned that Asher, that we're talking about, whose inheritance is a land that's full of olive oil. He's part of the camp of the tribe of Dan, and they're the last ones they're considered to be the least of the tribes, but they have a special function, and the Rebbe now connects this special function to the foot. Like we said, that Asher's foot is anointed; it immerses itself in oil. The tribe of Dan was the last one to travel when they traveled. אנשי מחנה זה צעדו אחרי שאר כל המחנות, ועל ידי כך הייתה להם אפשרות למצוא את כל החפצים שהמחנות הקודמים איבדו ולהשיבם לבעליהם. So as we said yesterday, they had the function of returning all the lost articles. פירוש הדברים שלמרות העובדה שמחנה דן צעד בסוד, דבר מורה להיותו בדרגה נחותה משאר המחנות, בחינת רגל, הרי למרות זאת, ודווקא בגלל זאת, השיבו את האבדות למחנות האחרים. So as we said, their special function is to return that which is lost. Now the Rebbe is going to say that which is lost is a symbol for something. What is it a symbol for? כאמור, לעיל נובעים כל הדברים גשמיים ורוחניות, והם מסמלים את מקורם כפי שהוא ברוחניות. So again, we flip the story. It's not that the material objects represent something spiritual, but rather the origin is the spiritual, and it thickens and becomes material objects. So it's actually the material object which is pointing back at its origin. So if you have this idea in the material world of someone who returns lost articles, that stems from the spiritual idea of returning lost articles. And how is that described? What it means to have something that's lost follows what the sages said, right? So we said this is like in our dictionary now, that this statement from Masechet Chagiga, from the tractate of Chagiga, that a fool is someone who loses everything that is given to them. So the word everything, right? How is this explained? בתורת החסידות מוסבר פירוש מאמר זה כך, מלמעלה ניתנה לכל איש ישראל בחינת מה. Everything is a trait that's given to every person. And the everything is called ma in Hebrew. Like Moses who said, and we are what? Or we are not. We're nothing. So ma literally means in Hebrew, it's not a interpretation. It literally means, v'nachnu ma, we are not nothing. It means this trait of being able to nullify yourself. Shehi hakoach leitbatlut le'elokut. It's the power of being able to nullify oneself to God. Ach biglal hayetzer hara, because of the evil inclination, nikra melech zaken v'ksil, which is called an old and foolish king. Why is he old and foolish? Because he is the first thing the person encounters once they're born. It says that he's called a na'ar, he's called a young person, because na'ar in Hebrew also means that he comes out the moment that nin'ar latzet mime'imo, the moment that he shakes in order to come out of his mother's womb. That's when the evil inclination already is fully active. But the divine soul and the good inclination takes it a much longer time. It could be in the early teens until it starts to become established in the person's mind. That's when he's fully established already. And so this fool, the evil inclination, it has a tendency to lose this power of nullifying itself to divinity. The idea here is very simple. It's that the evil inclination comes and says, why should you do what God told you? You should do what you want to do. What is this? What is he saying? He's saying the most important principle in the world is pleasure. And in many ways, everything that we know about modern psychology came from this, call it discovery of Freud's, that there's this pleasure principle. And the pleasure principle is what dictates all of our subconscious and preconscious acts. We're all built on the evil inclination is like basically the subconscious in a certain sense. So what's governing it? The pleasure principle. It wants to seek pleasure. It's always seeking pleasure for ourselves. What's the option? What's the other possibility? So I shouldn't seek pleasure? On the contrary, if the pleasure, what Freud identified as something that's very real, is that all the world is seeking pleasure. Everyone is seeking pleasure. The question is, who are you trying to pleasure? Who are you trying to give the pleasure to? That's the question. The fact that you should be seeking pleasure is built into being a human being. But the person who knows that he's created by God, he seeks to pleasure God. He seeks to give God pleasure. How do you give God pleasure? That's the basis of all avodas Hashem. That's the basis of all service of God. La'asot lo nachat ruach. To give him what we call a feeling of content spirit, that what I said was done. That is all called the raising, in Kabbalah that was called the raising of the feminine waters. Why the feminine waters? Because I acted below, and it raised pleasure up to God. It's not in order that he give me something in return. It's just to ask. I feel like my whole pursuit in life is pleasure. So why? So if I pleasure myself, so that's missing the whole point. That's exactly what the Yetzer Hara, that's exactly what the evil inclination makes you forget, makes you lose. That the whole idea of nullifying yourself to God is to ask, how can I give God pleasure now? Is this act that I'm about to do, is this going to give him pleasure? If this is not going to give him pleasure, I don't want to do it. It's going to give me pleasure. Said, Michael Toivis, I don't need it. I don't need this pleasure. It's exactly how you get over addictions, like for instance to sugar, to food. The person asks, this is going to give me pleasure? Don't need it. I don't need it. Is this going to give God pleasure that I'll be sick because I eat this food? I don't want to eat it. And if on everything that a person feels, he asks, who is this giving pleasure to? And then he sees, wait a minute, it's giving me the pleasure. I don't need the pleasure. I can give it. It's not only God. I can also do things for you. I can do things for my wife. I can do things for my children. I'm the last one in line. Why? Because I don't need it. I really don't need it. What do I need? I need to seek pleasure. But what kind of pleasure? To give pleasure to others. That pleasure is very important. We're not trying to say don't don't engage in pleasure. You should, but I want to give other people pleasure. That's exactly the point of life. If you just ask that question on everything that you do, everything changes right away. Like within 2-3 days, you'll be a completely different person. But to do that, you have to accept the premise that I was created in order to serve God. That was my purpose. Ani lo nivreti ela leshamesh et koni. How do I serve Him? How do I pleasure Him? By doing all these things. It starts from the sacrifices on the altar, that they were the original feminine waters that rise up, because from there the smoke, the smell rises up. Right? And that's what we say. We say, who am I davening to? It says that in the future we'll say this openly. This is a Meforash Arizal. The Rabbi Zakluria says, what does it mean that the Mashiach will come? It says that you'll see this, that leba lachotem ata mitpalel, ani mitpalel, ani mechaven, that I am praying, even my prayer, which supposedly is for me because I'm asking for things, but even that is because it gives pleasure to the one who has a nose. That's what he's called, ba lachotem. Why is it called he has a nose? Because that's the image from the Bible. The image from the Bible is that he wants sacrifices. So the smell rises up. That's the maim nukvin. That's the feminine waters that rise up. And the original, even by Cain and Abel, right? That was exactly, how did Cain know that his, right? Yaakov, how did Cain know that his sacrifice was not accepted by God? How did he know? Because the smoke didn't rise. The fact that it didn't rise means it wasn't accepted. But again, what does that mean? That even when I'm praying to God, I'm asking for things, I'm doing it because it gives Him pleasure. How can I explain that? Well, it's like I'm His child. In the same way that a father has pleasure when his little child comes and says, "Can you do this for me? Can you help me with this? And he wants a good thing. He's not looking to do nonsense. But he needs help. He doesn't know how to achieve it by himself. So he takes pleasure in that. So that's what it means to lose the what. To lose the what is to lose the premise of life, which is that I was created in order to serve God, which is to seek pleasure, but in order to give it to God and to others. It's specifically the foot that doesn't lose this. Why does the mind lose this? Because the mind is engaged in all kinds of things. The mind is very susceptible to the evil inclination. Not only that, but as we usually explain, the brain, the mind, the thought, the logic of most of us, as we develop, as we grow up, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, the mind comes to serve the animal soul. It comes to serve seeking my own pleasure. So even my mind is hardwired in a certain sense to seek my own gratification. It's very uncommon to find a person whose mind is wired in such a way that all he thinks about all day is how do I cause you to have a better life. It's very uncommon to find a 12-year-old that thinks that way. Sometimes you do. That's like a tzaddik. But most people, their mind develops in order to seek their own gratification. So the mind is very susceptible to falling into the state of seeking myself and forgetting that I have to be nullified before God. Again, to be nullified is not to not be human, it's to be very human. But I'm seeking the gratification of others, the gratification of Hashem. That's why it says about Dan, the tribe of Dan, that they are related to justice. Dan Yadin. Dan will be a judge. The Gemara in Maseches Pesachim tells us a story. Hahu de'amar dunu dinei. Dunu dini. There was a guy, a very simple guy, who anything that happened to him, he would say, let's go to court. I'm going to take you to court. Everything. Anything. Somebody took his napkin. He didn't give it back. I'm going to take you to court. Amrei Shma min amidan kate. So the sages that heard this person, they said, seemingly as a mockery, he's probably from the tribe of Dan. Why from the tribe of Dan? Because everything they do is judgment. Dichtiv Dan yadin v'gomer. ההנהגה של דון ודיני שביחס לכל דבר אף הפרוט ביותר מעיין אדם זה בשולחן ערוך לברר את ההלכה. יודע הוא שאין העולם הפקר וכי גם על דבר פעוט קיימת הוראה בתורה. But the Rebbe says, you can also understand this very differently. They weren't mocking him. He says he's a simple person. He's like a foot. He's a representative of the foot. And what does the foot know? The foot knows that the world is not hefker. The world is not without a judge. There is a judge in the world. There is God. And God gave a Torah, and the Torah says what you do in every situation. And he believes in his, call it Ne'evitei, that in the Shulchan Aruch there's a halacha for everything. So anything that happens, I can take you to court. There they'll tell me what is he saying. He says, I don't want to figure out by myself. I want to do exactly what the Torah tells me to do. That is the trait of the tribe of Dan. Meaning to be judgmental in this sense, to seek justice based on what the Torah says, is not something to be mocked. It's actually something that says this person is simple in his thinking, and he's straightforward, and he has no machinations, and he just says whatever the Torah says, that's what I want to do. He says in that sense, the foot saves the mind from over intellectualizing things. It's not that you don't need, you need the mind, you need to have a seichel, you have to think. You can't learn Torah without thinking. But if you don't have a foot, it doesn't save you from your thoughts. And you're over-intellectualizing, overthinking problems, and so on, can deter you from asking, what does the Torah say that you're supposed to do in such a case? And so this man, was very simple in his understanding, and that's how he understood things. So we'll have to end here today, and we'll continue tomorrow to further understand the relationship between the foot and the mind, and why the tribe of Asher was actually above the oil. Let's just mention one statement. It's a statement that's meant, and he's going to say it in a few paragraphs. There's a statement that the sage says, "Masha asta chokhmah keter lerosha." What wisdom made into a crown above its head, anava asta kev lesuliyata. Humility made into the sole of a shoe upon which it treads. So what's it saying? It's saying that wisdom sees a certain thing above it. It says that's its crown, that's as high as it goes. But with humility, that thing that wisdom thinks is the highest possible level you can attain, humility sees it as what you step on. This is how high humility is. The humility can actually take you higher than wisdom. And that's the idea of the foot being higher than the mind. It's not that you don't need the mind, you need it. But in certain situations, it's the humility of the foot that's willing to be the last in the body, that's willing to be the lowest, that's willing to do things just because Hashem wants me to give him pleasure, that is the highest, is much, much higher. Okay, so we'll see this tomorrow.